Kia ora everyone, it's great to have you here at today's session on our electricity market modelling results. Called Charlie Keeling aho. I'm a senior advisor in the communications and engagement team here at the Commission, and I'll be taking us through today's session. But before we get started, we have Bevan Hunter, principal advisor here at the Commission, who's working on our internal capabilities. We're really happy to have Bevan here to lead us into this session with the karakia. Kia ora, Bevan.
Kia ora. Ngā mihi kia tātou I runga I te pāka whakata reo nei, tēnā koutou katoa. Anei hi karakia tīmata. He hōnore, he karoria ki te atua, he mai ngā rongo ki te mata o te whenua, he whakaaro pai ki ngā tāngata katoa. Hanga e te atua he ngā kauhau, ki roto ki tēnā o mātou, whakatongi ato wairua tapu hei awhina, hei tohu e a mātou, gloria ki tō ingoa tapu ake, amini. Honour and glory to our Maker. May peace and tranquility reign throughout the nation, goodwill and thoughts to all mankind. God establish within each and every one of us a wholesome spirit. Let your spiritual being grow within us to help and guide us forever. Amen. Kia ora tātou.
Sorry, I was on mute then. Kia ora, Bevan. Thank you for that. So before we get started in today's session, it'd be great if you could please write your name and the organisation or community you represent in the chat while I'm talking us through this next bit. And please let us know where you're joining us from in Aotearoa. Those of you that have been on these sessions before will be familiar with this, but it's great to see who we've got on the call since we can't see everyone's faces. While you're doing that, I'll just give you a bit of an update on where things are at here. So as you're all hopefully aware by now, we released our draft advice outlining what Aotearoa could do to reach its climate targets on the 31st of January. And at 9 a.m. on the 1st of February, consultation on our draft advice opened to the public. And we've actually just extended the deadline for receiving submissions on our advice to Sunday, the 28th of March. We heard that some people needed some more time to consider this important piece of work, and we're really pleased that we can provide that. So until then, you can make a submission and tell us what you think about our mahi. I'll post a link to our consultation page in the chat at the end of this session. And I'll just note that it's important to remember we're open to changing our advice to reflect what we hear during this consultation period. And we're really keen to hear from you and are looking forward to find out your thoughts on our advice. During this session, you'll be hearing from our expert team and have the opportunity to ask questions. So you should see a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen where you can type your questions throughout the session. And please try to put them in here rather than the chat, because it just helps us to keep an eye on everything that's coming through. We unfortunately don't have time to answer all the questions on the call, but we'll get through as many as we can. And if you want to speak to each other or share your thoughts throughout, it's great to use the chat function. It's really helpful in terms of giving our team feedback, as well as the fact that we're recording this session so we can capture what you're telling us during the hour. And so I think that's enough from me for now. So I'm going to hand over to Antonia, Sean and Mark, who will be presenting today. Thank you, guys.
Okay, so kia ora everyone, ko Antonia Burbage aho. So I lead the Commission's Heat Industry and Power team. Hopefully most of you should know who I am by now, we've done a few of these. So I'm going to ask if Sean and Mark can also just introduce themselves quickly. We'll just start with you, Mark, since I don't think you've done one of these with us before.
I'm Mark Nelson, from a consultant from EnergyLink, who did some of the modelling.
Thanks, Mark.
Hello everyone, I'm Sean Buchanan. I'm an analyst at the Commission.
And Sam, can you flip us over to the slide pack, please? Great. Can you just maximize the slides? So for everyone today, we're going to go through the electricity market modelling that we did and that Mark actually did for us and that Sean led from the Commission side. So if that's not what you're anticipating, you are in the wrong Zoom and you should probably run away bravely now. So the work that was done, so Mark did it for us from EnergyLink, and it was done in November last year. It was done as a complementary piece of modelling to our main modelling tool, which was ENS. It doesn't determine the pathway for the electricity sector in the budget. It's a insight gaining exercise that we did. We used the results to inform our analysis and the work that we did with the commissioners to arrive at some of the recommendations that we made. Specifically, we used it to address some of the key questions that we had around the electricity system, where the ENS model is not very granular in its representation. The questions were focused primarily on the scenarios, the solution to the dry year, variation in gas price and the carbon price. Our focus was on the emissions consequences as our first order concern, and then price and security of supply were also considered. Can you flip us to the next slide, please, Sam? Perfect. And the slide again after that. Great. Okay, current market conditions. So we've had a lot of questions about our electricity price. It's not a forecast, but our electricity prices out to 2035 that were represented in the results that we had. And this is actually one we want to just, it's a bit of a weird order to do things in, but we wanted to jump off on this point. So a lot of the commentary we've had through the consultation so far has been that our prices are too low. And so I just wanted to address that up front, and then we can hopefully have a good discussion as part of the Q&A in this session about what it is that we're assuming and whether or not we are right or wrong, and what, if anything, we need to change. And we're really open to changing stuff in light of feedback. So I wanted to address this early so that you guys can ruminate on what I say and let us know what you think. So we really agree that we need electricity to be affordable and abundant for people to convert to electricity, and the electrification pathway is really clear in our results. So we know that transport needs to electrify, and for that to happen, people need access to good, affordable electricity. So we're confident that the long run marginal costs of renewable projects is low, and those costs are going to keep coming down. So it was interesting to see Meridian's new project at Harapaki come in about $60 a megawatt hour. Those forecasts keep getting cheaper and projects are coming on. We've seen other projects come on recently. So putting TY to one side for a moment, we also see significantly less gas in our pathway being used for electricity generation, which is interesting to when we think about the role of the carbon price and how much influence that's going to have in the cost of electricity if you consider less gas and less coal coming through the system. So allowing for some spikiness in the spot market from dry years and peak use of gas with carbon price coming in, and that getting incorporated into the forward contracts, we expect prices to be lower than what we're seeing in the spot markets today. And I did have a look this morning. I see they're still very high. So we recognise also that there are constraints in the gas supply with Pohokura over the last couple of years and with water, and that might not change, and have looked out at the forward contracts for the next few years as well. And that the dynamics of the market are really complex, and there are definitely people in this call that know far more than I do about that. And so putting that question back to the collective wisdom that we have here, are there other dynamics at play around market structure or power that we should be reflecting on for why we're getting this feedback that these prices are too low? And that's sort of, I'd really like to have a good conversation, and through this webinar or through follow-up conversations about what it is that we should be thinking about. So I'm going to stop talking now and hand over to Sean, but that's just something that I'd like to push back to the group here. So thank you, and I'm going to pass to Sean now.
Thanks, Antonia. And Sam, if you could please just jump on to the next slide. So as a reminder, and for context, the Commission's using a lot of different modelling tools. And first up, we kind of want to clarify how this work relates to our other modelling tools and how we've used it. In ENS, our model ENS, Emissions in New Zealand, is our bottom-up techno-economic model where we have the detail of all the emitting sectors across the economy. And that's what we've used to shape our pathway and to quantify our budget numbers. Because it's also counting cows and trees, kind of by necessity, it has a bit of a simplistic representation of the electricity system. So we've used EnergyLink's e-market model as sort of a bolt-on to gain a bit more insight into what's happening in the electricity system. So that's how we've used it. And in terms of our reporting, it's come through mostly in the commentary on market price. The Commission's also got a couple of other models, whole of economy and distributional impacts, which aren't relevant for what we're talking about today. And if you could jump to the next slide, please, Sam. Great. So then the context of this work is to complement the simplistic electricity system in ends with a more detailed market model, and with a really granular list of future generation projects, so that we can gain some insight into the build required, and to include dynamic demand modeling and test the system across weather years. So the e-market tool uses a long record of historic hydro flows. And when we model future years, we loop through that sequence of historic hydro flows kind of as a proxy for weather effects we would anticipate in future years. The model also has some dynamics around wind and solar patterns, which are going to become increasingly relevant as the electricity system has a greater proportion of those. So there's a shorter record of weather that is applied for those. And then looking back at ends, we can use this exercise to validate the more simplistic approach we've taken, specifically around market pricing and the thermal operation, which is what is determining system emissions, and also just to gain a bit of insight into big things which are, might be happening in the market around Tiwai closure and the Lake Onslow scheme, which has been discussed. And if you could jump to the next slide, Mark. Okay, sorry, not Mark, Sam. So this is our input out of ends, which shows the electrification of our economy as we transition towards this low carbon future. And out to 2035, this is well aligned with our recommended pathway and budget levels. And we can see that we have this big growth in transport electrification and in heating and building and industries. And we can also see the smelter coming off, which we have a clear and transparent assumption around. Next slide, please, Sam. Okay, our generation stack is large, and as it's going to have to be, and it's been informed by the updates that were undertaken by MB or on behalf of MB and published last year around future generation opportunities. So we've looked at those. John Coley did some consulting work for us, and he also looked across sort of technology trends for cost reductions that we might see for these technologies. And kind of the headlines from this table, sorry for a table full of numbers, is that for wind projects within our stack, as of now, we have LCOEs of around $60 a megawatt hour. I think the Meridian announcement agrees with that. And for geothermal, we're a bit higher, around $70 a megawatt hour. And in the current market prices, these are cheap generation builds. In terms of cost reductions, there's the most ambitious reductions projected for solar generation, which is what the percent per annum figures at the bottom of the table are showing. So solar and wind get cheaper, other things largely stay the same. And sorry, yep, if you could jump to the next slide, please. So, and just to lay out all of the detailed assumptions and probably the more conceptual assumptions for what we're doing with this model, just to help in our interpretation of what's coming out of it. So we're looking out a long way, and it's assuming that the current market structure is unchanged. And it's, I guess, kind of an idealized representation of that market structure, and that we don't have big generators and dynamics happening in that space. So in terms at a project level, generators act to I guess make money, to make the revenue. So there isn't this big collaboration between a project here and a project here. Another assumption is that new generation projects have to cover their cost. And that's something that Mark makes sure of when we drive the model. They have to pay for themselves. And they're manually deployed by an operator who has perfect foresight of what's coming in terms of demand growth. Networks are not a constraint. We're assuming that they can be built as required. Emissions pricing rises to $250 by 2050 in a straight trajectory. In our other modelling, we've talked about an emissions value rising to this level. And we've been quite specific that this doesn't correspond to an ETS setting, and other policies would have a role. So we have a bit of an inconsistency in that here it is and modeled as an ETS price that generators pay. We run the model mostly in day-night mode, except for a couple of reference years. And the gas price is around $9 per gigajoule, and it's not constrained. We do a sensitivity around higher gas pricing, which we'll talk to soon. And if you jump through a couple of slides, please, Sam. If we get on to the results. So this chart is showing the generation build in 5-year blocks looking out to 2050, and it's a massive build. So above the axis, we see generation added to the system, and below the axis, we see generation removed. Before 2025, there's a significant reduction in the use of gas and coal. So this is baseload thermal generation being displaced by these low-cost wind and geothermal projects. Between 2025 and 2030, we see some more wind and solar. The smelter is assumed to close around this time. So although we have high demand growth, the expansion of generation is somewhat muted. Following 2030, there's a huge expansion in wind and solar. So the numbers sitting above the bars corresponds to the number of unique projects in our generation stack, which need to be completed in this 5-year period. So between 2035 and 2040, we require, the modelling says 24 projects are required, which is a large number. Looking out towards the end of the path, the build gets through almost all the wind and solar projects in the generation stack, and we start to see some high-cost hydro and geothermal projects being completed. So there might be a bit of a maybe imagination limitation in what we've put in the generation stack. 30 years is a long way to look out, and no one's canvassed all the renewable opportunities that that might exist. If you jump to the next slide, please, Sam. So if we focus on thermal generation, and this is looking at an average across our simulated weather years, we see a dramatic downturn before 2025. And this is the baseload gas generators like TCC being displaced with projects like the Tauhara geothermal project, which has been proposed. So that, I mean, this is modelling, but also if we look to announcements in the news, we can see that a lot of these projects have been announced and appear to be going ahead. If we look at emissions, which is the plot on the right, we get a sharp downturn in emissions. And this is maintained all the way up to 2050, even as the system expands dramatically. Geothermal plants are contributing to our electricity emissions, about half of it. And there's a limited number of these as the modelled emissions price get quite high. However, we don't see any plant closure. Combined heat and power cogeneration plants also stick around in this future. So the model assumes that they continue to be viable through their heating services, although this might not be realistic at some of the model emissions pricing. And we'll just pause there and we'll answer some questions. So I'll hand back to Charlie.
Thank you, Sean. And we've had a couple coming through. So one of them says that this looks like a lot of gas retirement in the next few years. Do you assume they go until end of life or retire early?
I mean, I'm not sure what the plant turnaround schedule is off the top of my head for some of these plants. You know, presumably generators making decisions when you know, they commit to a project like Tauhara geothermal around what that means for their other generation assets, and that would be planned. Yeah.
Thank you, Sean. We had one as well that asked why is hydro removed. I note that we've got a response here that hydro is not removed, however, the percentage does decrease as little or no new hydro is built. Does anyone have anything to add to that, or happy with that one?
No, that was my reply. So,
do your demand projections assume changes to heating load, ventilation load, or irrigation load, or do you assume these stay the same between now and 2035?
I can take that one. So our demand profile is showing, you know, large scale electrification of heating loads and even the agricultural sector. So this is electrification of across the economy, considerable growth in demand. I think Mark was chipping in before as well, and we spoke over him, so we can go back to
sorry, I was just referring to the hydro figure. There's no hydros closed in the model, but the percentage of hydros decreases as the wind and other plants built.
Oh, and the chart might have had hydro below the line, but that would be spill in the way it's represented. So we end up with kind of a overbuild of renewable situation, but in terms of capacity, nothing's coming off. So if we look at energy, then we end up with some spill in this modelled system.
Sorry, I didn't realise I was on mute. I think that's all the questions we've got for now. So I'll just move on to the next section, presentation, and then we can come back to the questions after. Thank you.
Okay, back to me. And we're all coordinating mutes here, so apologies around any trouble. If you could jump a couple of slides forward, please, Sam. Okay, on to pricing. So this chart here is showing the nodal price at the Hayward's grid exit point, which is Wellington. So this is a central New Zealand price estimate. There is a regional variation, and it's looking at a simple average across all of the modeled weather sequences in our model. So that's what we're looking at. We see a short-term price reduction due to these lower cost renewable builds displacing gas and the assumed TY closure. So if we think back to the generation stack, projects with LCOEs, $60 to $70 per megawatt hour. So that's pulling the market price down. We see a minimum as TY closes. If TY didn't close, then we wouldn't hit the same minimum. Looking out beyond 2030, the price starts to kind of stabilize, and it becomes sort of driven by towards the long run marginal cost of the next generation project coming online. And although we're assuming that wind and solar get considerably cheaper in terms of capital costs, as these types of generation penetrate further into the market, we kind of end up with a penalty as they can all be generating at the same time, which lowers their value. So that's why the price doesn't continue falling. We also kind of start start constructing the less ideal generation sites. So things coming online now, Harapaki, maybe that's, that would be a very good location for wind generation, and there's not an infinite amount of those. There's a bit of a jump in 2037. That's when the model forces the E3P plant to close. And then as we look out to 2050, prices start going up. There's a few things coming in here. The CO2 price is getting higher, impacting thermal offers, which flows through to wholesale pricing. And we just start running out of low-cost wind and solar projects. And I mean, the generation stack is big, but we haven't assessed all of the renewable generation opportunity. You'd expect there to be other good low-cost projects which are realised in the future, which are not included in our generation stack. So there's kind of some, modelling world limitations, which we're walking up there, which we wouldn't necessarily expect to see in this future world. If you jump to the next slide, please. If we look across New Zealand, then we see a spread in pricing, with Upper North Island having the highest prices, and that's what this chart here is showing. We can see that when TY closes at that dip around 2027, that spread increases, and that's because we have greater proportion of generation further from demand. Next slide, please. So there's going to be a few histograms coming up in the following slides, so we might as well ease into them now. As we explained in our modelling approach, we test the electricity system for our demand growth with a long record of historic weather sequences, so hydro flows, and we've been showing prices and generation averaged across that full sequence. However, we also need to consider the distribution of prices and generation, which reflects the influence of the weather, largely hydro flows. So this plot shows the modelled distribution and wholesale electricity prices for this year, 2020-21. Sorry, 2021. Added an extra 20 there. And it's at that central Hayward's node. So although the model gives an average price of around $90 per megawatt hour, we also see model prices extending considerably higher in the event of low hydro years, And I guess to an extent, this is what we have currently. And the gas prices in the current situation would be pushing prices even higher. So there's another chance here to pause and take questions.
Thank you, Sean. And we've had a few come through, so I'll ask a couple now. Do you include new small run of river hydro and efficiency gains in hydro, therefore increasing the hydro total a bit?
I can answer that one. We do run existing small run of river hydro, although most of it is based on average generation. And in this case, we haven't taken into account any efficiency increases that might happen in the future.
Thanks, Mark. Our modelling shows slowly reducing LCOEs lead to gently reducing price, but much more price volatility because of increasing proportions of intermittent generation. Did you find this too?
Yeah, the volatility increases significantly once E3P is closed and gets worse as time goes by.
Thank you. With our current spot market model, where the marginal generator sets the price, low-cost RV will not necessarily reduce spot prices. How does the model account for this?
Sorry, I'm just catching up on something. No, it doesn't, and the model continues to work the same way, but the more baseload generations put in, the less opportunity there is to dispatch that higher price thermal generation. So there's some peaking generation that is maintained in the model and continues to be built, but the large thermals are all closed by mid-2030s.
Thanks, Mark. Have the effects of climate change on the hydro resource been factored in?
No, not at this stage. The hydro resource is entirely based on historical inflows. It is work that we as EnergyLink are looking to try and see if we can expand on, but there's still an awful lot of uncertainty as to how it might change in the future.
Thanks, Mark. I'll just ask one more before we go on to the next section. Does the projected CO2 emissions from geothermal take account of the point at which the ETS carbon price exceeds the cost of capture and reinjection of CO2 at geothermal facilities?
I can jump in on that one. So the model doesn't include capture and reinjection for geothermal.
Sean, I think we'll move over to the next part of the presentation now and leave more time for questions later.
Back to me. If you jump forward a couple of slides. Yep, perfect. So that's what we've just shown is kind of our central modelling, and that's informed some of the price commentary in our reports. We also did a number of sensitivity tests, which we've also commented on. So I'm going to talk through those now. And just to make it clear, the model runs we're showing at the moment are actually a slightly different electrification scenario. So we did the sensitivities around slightly lower or later demand growth, but the insights are still there. So in terms of the carbon price path, our central setting was rising to emissions price of $250 per tonne at 2050. And our sensitivity, we only ramped to half of that, so $125 a tonne at 2050. The higher carbon price translates to $7 a megawatt hour higher electricity price average across the record, and it hasn't had significant impact on emissions, although if And coming back to that question that was previously asked around geothermal carbon capture and storage, that those technologies aren't represented in the model, there's uncertainty around the cost and the opportunity there, but you might expect higher emissions price to pull down geothermal emissions more, or if higher emitting plants were not viable. What we haven't tested in terms of carbon price effects are what a step change in the current pricing and the pricing immediately would have on, I guess, the current suite of generation as of 2021. And we'd expect different effects for that, because we have a lot more gas in the system now than we do have by, for example, 2030. So in this future where we're running less gas, we have less sensitivity to that carbon price. Can you jump to the next slide, please, Sam? So the other sensitivity we ran was around gas pricing. And within our, we call it our pathway, which we've used to inform our budgets, which has these transitions across the economy, like beyond just electricity. In the gas space, we have an assumption around Methanex, who produce methanol and use a lot of domestic natural gas supply. And we have this assumption that they exit in 2029, and this could have a significant impact on gas supply, as Methanex operating in the market provide flexibility to other users, and they incentivize upstream investment. So we explored this. So there is a potential for gas for electricity generation to get more expensive, either because you're having to store large amounts of it, or even importing LNG. So these were dynamics we wanted to look into. We've kind of proxied them into the model by forcing a step increase in gas pricing in 2029. And we stepped to our ceiling price, which is our import LNG price of $14 a gigajoule. So relative to the central run, which doesn't have this increase, there's a step increase in market electricity price of around $20 per megawatt hour, which persists, and this would impact industry electrification. It might be useful for us, if we have a chance to go back and do more of this modelling, is to explore what the impact of gas prices increasing in 2021, 2022 would be on our market price. And we'll pause there again for questions.
Thanks, Sean. We've got a few come through that I'll ask now. So if thermal closes by the mid-2030s, do you then need demand response to meet winter evening peak in the model?
In this case, the response is by building new generation. So there's a significant increase in new generation, although some demand response is there are batteries, and of course peakers are also demand response.
Thanks, Mark. Do you consider batteries as peaking plants?
As peaking plants? No. Peaking plant in gas terms has a fuel, which means it can also be used for other things, such as dry year situations, whereas a battery can only store it for probably a fairly short term, or at least in this model, no more than a peaking for maybe an evening peak before it needs to refill for the next day. So it's really just a demand response process.
Thanks, Mark. Are hydro offers based on historical offers or on expected cost of shortage?
They're based on expected cost of shortage, so they're calculated water values.
Thank you. We've just got one more before we move on to the next section. Does the modelling make any allowances for the change in the cost of money over time?
No, it's all modelled real, isn't it? I think, Sean?
That's right.
Yep.
You know, real dollars and a constant capital recovery factor target for new generation.
Thank you both. Some good questions there. I'll hand over to Sean again for the next final bit of the presentation before we have some more time for questions at the end. Thank you.
Great. So the final bit of modelling we did as part of this exercise was around a pump storage scheme operating at Lake Onslow, 5 terawatt hour energy storage. And we undertook this really as an insight gaining exercise, mostly in terms of emissions, because I guess that's our #1 focus. So what would pump storage mean for electricity emissions in New Zealand? Also considering some of those pricing dynamics. So in the model, the scheme becomes operational at around 2033, and I think it takes 2 or 3 years to fill. It runs at 70% efficiency, so we have some operational pumping losses, and it operates in the market by purchasing electricity and on selling later, and uses water values to manage scarcity. It operates on an intraday, intra-season, and of course intra-year timescale. It covers the cost of operating, but it doesn't try to pay for its capex. Yeah, okay, and if we jump onto the next slide, then we run into a mighty stack of histograms, which we eased into before. So this chart is showing the thermal generation, which runs from every year from 2021 to 2029, as simulated across all our hydro flows. So the top part of the stack is 2021 this year. And the chart's showing that we get a variation in thermal generation across our hydro flows of around 5 terawatt hours, which we can kind of consider as the size of our dry year problem. As we step into the future, when the Tiwai closure happens and we have all this baseload renewable coming on, displacing plants like TCC, you can see that this distribution collapses on the y-axis. And that is saying, so prior to that, in some years, regardless of our hydro inflows, we ran some amount of gas. So we're kind of interpreting that as base load. So once this generation change happens, we no longer have that base load gas. We still have a dry year problem of around 4 terawatt hours. It might have slightly reduced as hydro plays a smaller role in the system with other build coming in, or just having Manapori power for service. Okay, as we jump to the next slide, and all its complexity, so we're looking at 2 futures now. The left-hand stack is showing the gas generation, which is operating in a world without the Onslow scheme. And the right-hand stack is showing operation with the Onslow scheme. And I can't draw arrows on the screen, but in the upper right corner, we're kind of pointing to the years around 2031 to 2034, where the scheme's coming online. And we start to see that the distribution, so the variance in gas generation starts to decrease in the case where we have the Onslow system. Once we force our E3P plant to close, that distribution collapses. So this says that independent of our hydro inflows, I'll talk it the other way. The gas generation, which is required for the system, no longer depends on our hydro inflows. We've hit 99.8% renewables. We haven't eliminated gas. That wasn't the purpose of the exercise. It's still around for peaking applications. And then the counterfactual is the left-hand stack, where we see at the end of this period, at 2040, we still have a dry year problem of around 2.5 terawatt hours. Jumping to the next slide, which is looking at the following decade all the way to 2050. So as I mentioned before, we still have some residual gas in the system for peakings. If we were trying to completely chase gas out of the system, then maybe you could throw in a lot of batteries and further overbuild renewables, take that out. That wasn't the point of this exercise. We were trying to see the benefit of the scheme on hydro inflows. Next slide, please. So this chart appeared in one of the chapters in our evidence report, which is kind of the result of this, averaged across all our hydro flows. And we're looking at thermal generation again in terawatt hours. So once operational, the scheme removes around 0.6 terawatt hours on average, which is equivalent to around 0.3 megatons of CO2 emissions. That's kind of the emissions consequence of it. I mean, I think part of the point of this project is the strategic value of having such an asset in terms of removing your dependence on gas. So that's not a question the model's answered. The MB New Zealand battery team will be thinking over all those things. If we look at market pricing, which we'll show, so the next slide, please, Sam. So again, in this case, averaged across the years. So there's a lot of uncertainty around how such a scheme would operate in the market, and we haven't solved that. So, and the way we've implemented it in the model, in order to ensure all the generators still make revenue, we've scaled up the gas price so that the peakers are offering at a higher price. And without this adjustment, the model market price collapses. And the problem with this is that generators don't cover their costs. The system no longer works. So that's what we're looking at in this plot. So we're not really comparing apples and apples, but the outcome is that we have similar pricing. And as a reminder, we've not included the capex of Onslow. We have no idea what that is, or the HVDC upgrade that the model required in the system to make it work. Finally, we have a stack in pricing with and without. I don't think I've included it here because it was in the other slide deck and we looked at it. I don't think we have anything particularly useful to say here. With the pumped hydro scheme, we don't see the price not collapsing, but or collapsing on a stable point. But we did do this adjustment with the gas price scaling, which might have distorted that. So in summary, just the last slide. Oh, sorry, that was the distribution slide I was just talking to. And if we jump on to the next one, the model shows that the scheme would largely decouple thermal generation from lake inflows and wind and solar seasonal variation as well. But we still have gas in the system for peaking purposes, and getting rid of that was not the point of the exercise. But in terms of renewables, we're at about 99.8%. I haven't shown it, it's in the slide deck on the website. We reached quite high levels of renewables, just independent of this as well. And that's all of the material. So there's a bit more time for questions.
Thanks, Sean. I'm going to ask this one first. So a $5.4 per gigajoule increase in gas price increases electricity price by $20. Since this increases short-run marginal cost of gas by about $40 per megawatt hours and $125 of CO2 increases short-run marginal cost of gas by approximately $50 per megawatt hours, can you explain why the electricity price with CO2 charge only increases the price by $7?
Well, I can have a go at this, I suppose.
Yeah, let Sean have.
Sorry, you go, Mark.
In the model, baseload gas is gone. So there's no baseload gas. It's gone by 2030 something. And so that decouples it to some extent against the price and the calculations that were read out in the question. You've now also, as price increases, more and more renewable generation is being built because it's of much lower price than what the gas is doing. So you now need to get more peakers to be able to support the price, to be able to stay open. So what you're actually looking at is what the change in price is once you've added a whole lot of extra renewables because they're being built because the price now supports them.
Mark. Sorry, just bear with us 1 second. Just a technical issue.
Doesn't appear to be working, but hopefully you can hear me. Just a clarification to add to was that difference in the carbon price is a gradual increase out to 2050 rather than a step change. So that may have affected the comparison that you've made there, Andy.
Thanks, Paul. The distribution of EV charging throughout the day will have a big impact on peak loads. How have you modelled time of use demand from increased EVs?
That's a really good question and a very difficult one to answer. I know how we've modelled it. What we modelled was the EVs have a daily demand profile that we've applied. It's relatively simple. It's a nighttime profile is about half the amount of the daytime. So it's assumed to be flat during the day and higher but flat during the night.
Thanks, Mark. We've got one here. Has the choice of 70% efficiency of the operational pumping losses from the Lake Onslow scheme taken account of the greatly increased evaporative losses and groundwater flow losses from Lake Onslow occurring when the area and height of the lake is substantially increased?
The answer would be no. It's a very simple model, which it just as a water balance, it doesn't take any of those into account. The efficiency value was one that's come up from doing research of what these sorts of types of systems would be able to achieve. So I guess maybe it is taken into that number, but it's just based on sort of other plants efficiencies that they gain when they do this sort of thing.
Thanks, Mark. And this one I think is for Antonia. Why has CapEx recovery been excluded for the Onslow evaluation?
Hiya, thanks for the question. Charlie, do you want to mute? Okay, perfect. I'm sorry, we're just struggling with our mutes again. So we didn't think about the CapEx. We didn't include a number for the CapEx because we don't have a number, right? I don't think anybody has a good number at the moment for how much we think building a hypothetical Lake Onslow solution to the dry year is going to cost. And so we'll wait and see what the New Zealand Battery Project conclusions come to, and we'll revisit this modelling in a couple of years' time when we look at the emissions budgets 2 and 3 again, and we'll have better information and better data to inform the modelling then. You know, the sort of the way that we've modelled how this hypothetical project would operate in the market is just, you know, one stab at any number of ways that it could operate in a market. It's not a very sophisticated look at the solution, and it was never intended to be, because there's the real open question about what the role of the Climate Change Commission is in thinking about, you know, the solution here and possible market design and those kind of things. And I think our role was just to think about what the potential emissions displacement could be from a project based on the very little information that there is out there at the moment about it. And we wanted to do an exercise to get some more information in order to help inform our conclusions. And that's what this was. It was a sort of more than a back of the envelope, but not an attempt at an actual answer exercise, in order to be able to inform our conclusions. And it was a really interesting exercise, and I'm sure lots of other people will be doing other interesting exercises on this, and, you know, we'll be part of that conversation. But we didn't try and solve everything by any means.
Thanks, Antonia. We maybe have time for one more, but we'll see how we get on. This one I think is for Sean. The market is so sensitive to lake inflows and levels. So what is the confidence level on this forecasting, given that climate change has not been factored in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And just clarifying, it's not really a forecast, but the question's still a really good one. So as Mark explained earlier, those climate change impacts are not part of the model. In our tome of evidence, somewhere in the 700 pages, there's some text talking about future impacts of climate change on future energy system. And we referenced to a NIWA study, which was working its way to publication last year, looking at future climate models overlaid with lake catchments. And I think the headlines were, we kind of have the, rather than the system gets better, rather than the winter shortage of water, it moves seasonally. So there's more water in the winter when required.
Thanks, Sean. I think that might be all we have time for now. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who's come to the session today. It's been really great to hear from you all, and we hope you've learned a lot. I'll just pop the link to our consultation site in the chat. As I said earlier, and we'd really love to hear from you during this consultation period, and listen to what you've got to say on our advice. And we've been running quite a few of these sessions and have a couple more to come. So if you can keep an eye out on our website and social media channels for recordings of previous sessions and upcoming sessions. I'll share the link to our events page in the chat now as well. And then I think it's time for Bevan to see us out with a karakia.
Kia ora.
Kia ora, Bevan.
Tēnā koutou mua koutou awhina I tuku mai hei tautoko I tā tātou hui me te kaupapa nei. So thank you all for your many views, questions, interactions and the time that you've invested in this kaupapa. Kia tau kia tātou katoa, te ata whai o tō tātou ariki a ihu karauti me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga o te wairua tapu a ki amini. Kia ora.